Hello and welcome to the Eastern Kicks podcast, a regular magazine programme about East Asian film led by me, Andrew Heskins, founder and grandmaster of EasternKicks.com, and James Mudge, our leading writer.
Hey-o.
Each episode we'll be taking a look at the latest films, news and festivals, often chatting to filmmakers and stars along the way. Welcome to the latest show. With the recent release from Criterion of new 4K remasters, we're going to talk about the Infernal Affairs Trilogy, from that classic original film to, well, the third film. But more about that later. This time, Stephen Palmer has joined us.
Hello, boys. Hello, everybody.
All right. While later on, Phillip O'Connor will share his thoughts on the whole inevitability of the fate for the pair at the centre of the films. But you know what? Let's start with that first important question. What are you drinking this episode, James?
Well, I'm currently in Scotland in the middle of nowhere, and I'm drinking Tennent's. nice big can of Tennent's lager. Well, a nice few big cans of Tennent's.
On brand.
It's probably when you're going for that kind of cheap lager, which it is, it's probably the best of a variable bunch. You know. And I've got some whiskey as well, which is not actually very nice whiskey. It's Chivas 12. But there you go. Blame Tesco for Morrison's for replacing it in my order because I just couldn't get what I wanted. But anyway,
I should have refused it, James.
How
about you, Stephen?
Well, as always, because I'm teetotal, I always feel completely out of place on this bit of the podcast.
But no. You can always have a posh juice.
So what I have is Harry Brompton's London Peach Iced Tea, which is something. Iced tea is something.
Posh.
Well, not really. It sounds posh, but yeah,
it's posher than a Tennant, surely.
Yeah.
Well, I do fear that James is so on brand, it's scary.
Living the life, living the dream. So this episode, I am on some Hacker Score Oktoberfest Marzen, a sort of leftover from the Oktoberfest. I am actually breaking the law by drinking it outside of October. I think I can probably be chased by a German and I don't know, something terrible might happen to me. Purity laws. Yes. And that is, I know we got to talk about this, is actually a bit low for me. It's only 5.8%.
Well, Tennent's is about 4%. So, yeah, you're still winning in this one.
So, and on to Infernal Affairs, recently restored in 4K by old friend and occasional guest BD Cheng, and by his company L'Immaginale and released by Criterion in the US and UK on Blu-ray.
祝你哋喺警察部一帆風順。
我想做好人。
韓心單嘢衰咗，我懷疑有內鬼，想你入去查下。
點解係我啊？
公司有驗仔，你知啊？
我搞掂佢。
So where to start with the chat? I think it's worth starting and putting this in some context. So the idea of the undercover cop, which is rife in American films as well, really became a bit of a thing in Hong Kong films. We've got the classic City on Fire, of course, which eventually became Reservoir Dogs, with Chow Yun-fat and Danny Lee. We've got earlier than that, we've got the Alex Young Hong Kong New Wave film, Man on the Brink, which actually does, plot-wise, has a lot of overlap, particularly with, I think, the second film in the Infernal Affairs series. And for me, I think one of the big influences on this is The Longest Night, which also starred Tony Leung. It's all much darker, but yeah, I don't think. I mean, that film always kind of gets a bit missed out of the slightly sort of complicated Milky Way history, in that it was credited as being directed by Patrick Yao.
That's right, yeah.
Mainly directed by Johnny To. But it's a great film. I mean, what are your thoughts on some of the...
Sure, Stephen, you want to go first then?
No. I mean, I was just thinking you covered it all, but for me, there is a thing that this isn't anything we hadn't seen before, in terms of any sort of crime thriller with the undercover cop or whatever in Hollywood or Hong Kong cinema. It's just that for me. I mean, I remember seeing a trailer for this in the cinema, at a proper cinema, you know, not a boutique cinema or something like that, and it was that it somehow had this crossover appeal, and I'm not, you know, was it because it was we'll talk about it as we go on, but
I think we'll come on to that. But
it's just, you know, the glossiness of it, the superstars that are in it, and all that kind of thing, and it just doesn't feel like a film that is. You know, like totally embedded in Hong Kong, if you get what I mean. Yeah, it's got kind of a general appeal because this is a sort of story that we've seen before, and you don't have to be a Hong Kong film expert or aficionado to grasp it.
I think we'll come on to a bit more of that, kind of looking at the kind of success of the film, you know, particularly the first one when it came out. But I mean, I guess the one thing that this did have was. The one little kind of flip of the idea is that it's not just the police that have an undercover agent, it's the triads have an undercover agent as well, which kind of flips the idea of we were used to seeing corrupt cops, which again, I mean, you see it in Long Night, you see it in lots of but it's very much a Hong Kong crime thriller thing, but they actually have two undercover agents that they kind of mirror each other. And I think what works about it in a sort of Hong Kong context is that this, what is that kind of almost wuxia mirror image, the always, like even in films like City on Fire, you've got the undercover cop who's completely divided in his loyalties and you know, his morality as well, and that's explored in the Infernal Affairs series. I think that was the one thing that that the films did have in the sort of the idea, and I guess the other thing that the whole trilogy does is they keep having these quotes about the sort of Buddhist idea of continuous hell and continuous suffering, and not being an expert on Buddhism by any means, but you know they keep bringing this up. You know, like the quotes in the first film. Not knowing how well it's translated, but yeah, the worst of 8 hells is called continuous hell. It is the meaning of continuous suffering. That's the name. Yeah, okay, yeah. According to Buddha, he who is in continuous hell never dies, except when he does. But then he doesn't, as we find out with the trilogy. So it is a little bit of a riff. It is a bit of a different idea, and I kind of to play into a bit of what we're talking about, the success of this film. We have this core creative team throughout the trilogy, who then go off and do several other films, and we'll get into that later on. But yes, you've got the directors Andrew Lau, who had started as a cinematographer and worked for Wong Kar-wai, and Alan Mak. And Alan Mak was also the screenwriter with Felix Chong, and they started quite a partnership that ran throughout the noughties and into the 2010s. And the editors on the film were Danny Pang and Kuren Pang. I'm not sure of the relation. Obviously he is a relation, but you know. So Danny Pang is quite an established filmmaker in his own right. Kuren Pang, who's always been the sort of right-hand man of the Pang Brothers films. So you've got a really solid team behind them. And then, you know, as you were saying, Stephen, you've got this, you know, we start with these, you know, two of the biggest stars, Tony Leung, who I think much more than Andy Lau had a real international appeal thanks to In the Mood for Love. And it's interesting that, particularly on that first film, the visual consultant is Christopher Doyle. So you've got the Wong Kar-wai connection coming in again. You've got a great cast. I mean, you've got Ashley Wong, you've got Eric Chang, you've got really great female leads who aren't necessarily, as often a criticism of a lot of sort of gangster type films, that they're not really given a lot of screen time. But I always feel like they that here you don't see much of Kelly Chan, and you don't see much, particularly Sammy Cheng. But what they do is absolutely fantastic. Yeah. So, I mean, that first film, I think we all can remember kind of seeing it the first time and being really impressed by it. Looking back, what do you guys make of it now?
It's still just as good as it was. In some ways, kind of better than it was, I guess, because at the time when it came out as well, we were kind of in that sort of mad swathe still of Asian content coming across right at the start of the 2000s and stuff. So it was still great, and there were so many great films coming out then and everything. But to an extent as well, for a lot of people, who is learning about Hong Kong cinema and everything like that, it's still, now when I watch it again, I can see what a departure it was from the 90s, from Hong Kong cinema and everything, because Hong Kong cinema was pretty much dead by that late 90s, whether it was the financial crisis, the box office collapse, and SARS and everything like that, then the handover coming in, so everything about it was in complete chaos, and not in a good like Hong Kong 80s chaos type of way and stuff.
大家咁話，
你知我睇到你咩牌？我認緊。
其實我係差人。喂，感哥啊，呢度咧而家我要揸上，如果要出貨嘅，俾電話我啦。你收到我嘅 channel，
搶仔你冇落去。
嗰陣時算我寫唔到落去啊，我都唔知嗰人好人定壞人。
你就係嗰隻牌。我以前冇得揀，我而家想揀翻做好人。對唔住，我係差人。
Looking back at it now and seeing the context under which it was made and everything, it's not. As Stephen was saying, like, it's nothing you haven't seen before and everything. But when I watch it again now, I haven't seen the remaster, but I saw it again not long ago, and you can really, it's got a different level of craftsmanship than a lot of stuff in the 90s. 90s Hong Kong was still portraying Hong Kong as like chaotic, quite dirty and quite sleazy and neon lights and everything. The 90s was a kind of a mixture of that and the kind of John Woo side of action. And then when he went off to Hollywood, it just left this void in Hollywood action cinema, because Johnny To hadn't really stepped up properly into action at that point still. So,
and I think also it did create a different. And I think for some of us who followed a lot of been following Hong Kong film for years by the point this came along. As you say, it deliberately went a different line in terms of the action. It didn't try. And there were lots of people that did try and do action films, but, if it's not going to quite get to that sort of hard-boiled, better tomorrow kind of level of excellence, then it's never going to be the same. Whereas this deliberately went for something that was much more cerebral. Watching it again recently, I think, and this is something I always find with particularly the first one, there's a lot that happens in the first sort of 20-odd minutes where it's doing a lot of setting up.
Yeah.
And that's quite a lot to take in. Mm-hmm. And it's like when they get into that first scene where they're doing the stakeout and there's a tapping on the window, etc. We should have said up front, if you haven't seen the Infernal Affairs Trilogy, there will be spoilers.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any way we could talk about the trilogy without there being spoilers, because just by the very note of doing it.
I think if you're listening to this podcast and you haven't seen it in the last 20 years, you're not really sure.
You're probably listening by mistake.
But he's at that point that it really kind of settles into itself. And the way that it's put together, The first film is easily, it is the shortest of all of them. It's only just over 100 minutes. It kind of come back to what I was kind of suggesting before by talking about some of the characters. A lot of the characters are around. You see them, but not for very long. You've got the Chatmantos, the very likable, chubby little gangster, who throughout the whole series actually. And you've got the wife of the Andy Lau's character by Sammy Cheng and so on. There's a lot of lean filmmaking in this. There's not a lot of. It doesn't dwell too much on. Once we get into that sort of 20-minute point, there's not a lot of dwelling on the background of the characters. It's doing a lot with very little, in a really good way. I think the writing and the way it's edited gives you absolutely everything you need to know about these characters, the performances and what they do, without going into it a hell of a lot. It doesn't really. It doesn't waste a lot of time with. Once you've passed that initial block of exposition, it doesn't waste a lot of time really kind of throwing any more of that at you, I think.
No, and that's true, and that's one of the other interesting things about the film, because it's essentially a Hong Kong sort of version of Face Off, and I think that was the main inspiration behind the film, because they were still looking at what John Woo was doing and everything like that. But they looked at Face Off, and then they actually dialed it down. Whereas you'd usually assume Hong Kong cinema, especially in the 80s or 90s, would dial it up, and it's John Woo. So they looked at, they essentially took the plot of Face Off and then dialed it way back down, which is interesting, because that's the other thing. I mean, as you were just saying there, it's a very efficient film in its storytelling, and John Woo, it's got. You can imagine if John Woo directed it, there'd be so much more close-ups or crying or backstory flashbacks and everything like that, and so much. But it dispenses with all that stuff. Much more efficient, much more, in a way, kind of more similar to some of the Milky Way stuff before Johnny To really sort of got convinced he was making operas, and it's. But the efficiency is what another thing that's really struck me when I watched it again. Even though it has all these elements of other films, whether it's Face Off, there's so much that the mirroring thing is just so much all the way through it. It's just, but they don't go down the full John Woo route and everything with it, and there's so much you'll read into it about the handover and the confusion of identity of Hong Kong and stuff like that. But even that, they don't. Everything about it, to an extent, is slightly muted. And you were saying, like, with these first action scenes, they're not really action scenes. It's just like a lot of, you say, tapping, or is someone going to get found out? It's not action in the same sense of action.
Yeah, so it's a lot of suspense.
It's a thriller, but not in the Hong Kong way.
Yeah. And I think there was. I mean, you're also looking back. I mean, particularly with the first film, there is, as was actually quite prevalent at the time with some of the horror and so on that was coming out from there was very much an eye on trying to sell this to the West to have something that could be an international success rather than just in Hong Kong.
I think, yeah, definitely.
And maybe as well a sense of the timing as well, that at this point in the early 2000s, that the Hong Kong filmmakers, that the industry was, kind of falling apart somewhat. And that international look was looking at the West before the mainland market really opened up. And I mean, the mainland market really didn't do anything for Hong Kong
for anyone.
But if more films had gone down this line, I think it would be interesting. And again, we can kind of come back to this in terms of the legacy and influence of this. But it does feel like there was something quite interesting here, the way that this was. That this was moving and the way that this was kind of taking all these things on board and I think and getting this nice balance between something that is quite accessible to more Western viewers, but actually is still very, very Chinese, very Hong Kong in the way that it deals with this, the whole kind of Yang Gang brotherhood kind of things that John Woo did so well, but just doing it in quite a toned down way that could have gone in quite a different direction, I think, for what came next.
I mean, it's incredibly talky, right?
Yeah.
The scene from the first film I remember the most. So Anthony Wong and Eric Chang talking to each other over a Chinese meal. This isn't John Woo, kinetic, bullets, doves, explosions. It doesn't feel like what most people would have considered a Hong Kong police thriller to be like at all. It's a lot of people talking. There's a lot of, like you said, there's a lot of exposition set up at the beginning, which interestingly sets up the second film. It's there already. But I don't remember too much of the action. I remember the suspense, but I remember the conversations, the talking, the looks. And even then, it's not even tied into language, and there's lots of looks. There's that duality and mirror, that yin and yang stuff that James has already talked about. It's embedded through this film, and it looks great. It looked great before a 4K restoration. It's and I like James. I didn't see the when I did a review of the film that shall not be named, the third one. I just chucked on my already existing Blu-ray that I had of it, and it looks great. It looks of the time. Lots of films in the early 2000s look like that. The blues are dialed up and all that sort of cold framing sort of stuff going on, but. It doesn't look like a film from maybe 5 years before either, and I think it's got that more generic appeal to it. So absolutely, all the themes very Chinese, very Hong Kong, but it doesn't look like a Hong Kong film.
Seeing it for the first time as well, and it was one thing I wasn't ready for. And this is a spoiler, but again, you will already know this. Is the scene when Anthony Wong flies out of a building and lands on a taxi.
Yeah. I remember that being really quite gripping at the time. Really quite astounding at the time. You knew it wasn't going to go well for him, but still the way it kind of played that out, I thought was, just really quite. It's the bagpipe music. When they start overlaying some of the soulful tunes of the well played bagpipes, which doesn't.
There was some bizarre. It's kind of stepping to this, and I won't let this become too much of an attraction. There's some interesting musical choices.
There are.
The first couple of films have some quite almost kind of Middle Eastern kind of, which I guess was a kind of a bit of a thing in the early 2000s.
Oh yeah,
but you have got the bagpipes, particularly sort of the burial scenes. I think we can come back to this, but in the third film, another kind of really strange bit is the mainland Chinese character played by Chen Domen is playing Old Lang Syne on a harmonica.
That's just. It's baffling that the Old Lang Syne.
That is pure Hong Kong. I think that's where you really know you're watching a Hong Kong film. If you get something kind of very sweet little things. And of course, we're going to keep on the music thing. Of course, the original film does end with a duet between Andy Lau and Tony Leung.
Yes,
which was quite surprising to see old Tony wax the vocals there.
And there's that Taiwanese song which just recurs all the way through them. Whose name I forget.
Yes.
Whenever they're testing their mad stereos and that.
Yes.
So the music definitely plays a part. But, I can remember it perfectly. I just don't know the name of it or who sang it, and it's probably something really famous. But there you go.
It's probably some Teresa Toe or something, isn't it? That we should all know.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
But,
the song is actually "Forgotten Times" by Taiwanese pop and folk singer Tai Chin.
But no, I think that's something you can see. When you're talking about having Anthony Wong in there, everything as well. You have quite a few of these. You've said before, Sammy Chang and Kelly Chen having these tiny roles in the film, which a lot of people really didn't expect when it first came out. And Anthony Wong was still known as the Category 3 man at that stage as well. So him playing this, and then Eric Tsang playing it's a serious role. He still gets a few wacky lines in there and stuff. So many, Andy Lau being role reversal. So many of the when they were writing at Felix Chung and his name, that's where they would have put most of their effort, and it's actually reversing expectations. So for a lot of Hong Kong audiences, especially, that was one of the other things about it. It was so many people in it were actually playing against type or against expectations. So which is, when you look back at it now and everything, actors like Anthony Wong has gone on to do so much other kind of stuff. It's not quite as big a thing, but at the time, you know, he was still like Mr. Untold Story, Ebola Syndrome, everything like that.
He hadn't been in Beast Cops.
Yeah, he'd been in Beast Cop, but still.
But he was still. It was very different.
He goes on a rampage. So.
That's true. And that, yeah, I mean, we can come on to that in a bit, but also that's carried on definitely into the second film of the trilogy as well. Yeah.
你哋有啲警務人知法犯法。
冇條例，我哋唔可以同差佬做朋友㗎係嘛？
畫面裏邊嗰個算唔係差人？我認罪阿 Sir，我犯咗法。
佢以前嘥過我，就唔爭再俾佢殺多次。
殺人放火啊金腰帶，修橋補路啊冇屍骸。我已經輸咗，個世界唔應該係咁嘅，做人唔應該係咁。
So the second film, we have is actually a prequel. So we get to see how they came to be, and kind of looking back actually, because I kind of recently watching through the films. One thing, I mean, there's a couple of things. One thing that's really obvious is how much they really do try and make this quite Godfather. And I remember, back in the times, there were a lot of comparisons to the Godfather trilogy. Well, ultimately, they call it the Godfather trilogy. And I think we could go, to a certain extent, we could kind of agree that in some ways, this has something in common with that. In that part 2, in some ways, is better than part 1. But if you want to kind of carry that comparison on, however bad you think The Godfather Part 3 is, it's not as bad as... But we'll come on to that in a bit. But I mean, but in order to create that, kind of looking back, I did kind of realise that it really did retcon a few of the bits of the first film. So
yes, it did quite a lot.
Whereas the... we have... let's talk about the cast, because we have... Sean Yu playing the Tony Leung character, and Edison Chen playing Andy Lau character. And it's to kind of further what Stephen said earlier, that was really nice is you have them already in the first film. They are there. But yes, so the suddenly the Tony Leung character who Sean Yu character who in the first film is said, oh well, he deliberately leaves because he's a very talented cop and they want somebody really talented in the other one, underworld. Suddenly it introduces this whole family thing, that he is actually connected to the big triad, related to the Nais, who are led by Francis Ng, who is, again, we always talk about people playing against type, and and his performance in this is absolutely astounding. Very, very just kind of... I mean, he can do it well, but he is so good at like playing either massively over the top or massively under, and really... But yeah, suddenly it's a whole family thing. Suddenly that he's connected to the family, and that's why he gets kicked out of the police, but still wants to be this good person. So I mean, that was one thing that kind of, looking back, I was like, oh yeah, you kind of essentially kind of retcon what happened in there.
I'm all right. I'm all right with that. Some retcons are dreadful, and some retcons you think, all right, this gives us somewhere. I mean,
in a sense, they can kind of get away with it by almost kind of suggesting they didn't go into that much detail.
Indeed, because it's just in that little section at the beginning, right? But if you're gonna, the nice thing about this is it isn't a repeat of what went before. It's enhancing the story. It's got a new story. I mean, I guess it's still about some crime lord taking over from another. But that kind of cycle and repetition. That's
there's some really nice parts about that. I mean, in a certain sense, whether this is better or not than the first film, you do need the first film for a lot of the things that work about Infernal Affairs 2 to work. Right from the very beginning, there's this great chat that you see. Anthony Wong is talking to someone about this terrible incident that happened on his first day on the job as a policeman. And then all of a sudden, you realise he's talking to Sam, who is the Eric Chan character, the arch rival, and you see that there's this weird relationship between the two, and that the Anthony Wong character, who usefully is called Inspector Wong in the trilogy, he's kind of being quite Machiavellian, and actually most of the time these Machiavellian kind of plans that he have don't actually work out particularly well. But it's such a great scene to start. But you suddenly that it has that little reveal as well, that the way that's played out is
and of course great. Echoing similar scene from the first film. There's a fair bit of that going on in the second. So like I say, a lot of sequels just redo the first.
Or even prequels.
Or even in absolutely. Yeah. Whereas this kind of does, but it just builds on what was before. Whether people think it's a better or worse. I mean, I personally think it's superior in many aspects. As a story, it's far more interesting. It maybe doesn't have that uniqueness that maybe the first film had. With I
think what this gains, in a sense, what this gains is that it actually doesn't need to do all the setting up. So we get straight into the pacing of this, and the pacing feels absolutely perfect. It doesn't have that kind of rushed exposition, because if you'll come to this film and you haven't seen Infernal Affairs, then forget it.
No, you're not going to get.
And I like that. I mean, that's the whole point. I mean, in this one, I think you can say that unlike, again, coming back to kind of the usual thing for sort of gangstery films, you do have an amazing performance by Karina Lau, Tony Leung's better half. She's a really great character, and it's interesting the way it sets up the Andy Lau's character and how he ends up with another woman called Mary as well. There's all these kind of little.
Sorry, I do like the second one a lot. I prefer the first one just because there's so much of that stuff in the second one. And it does. I guess all these coincidences in it and everything that tie into this overall. You could say it ties into the overall idea of fate, or you could say it ties into the producers knowing that to make the second one a big hit, they had to tie back to the first one as much as possible. I don't know. I still like it a lot, but I think it lays it on a bit thick with some of the callbacks and some of the stuff and everything like that. And it is as a prequel. I mean, most prequels are terrible, so it is like that. But then again, I prefer The Godfather to The Godfather 2, so I don't. I think that's just part of it's my natural inclination away from prequels. But I do love the efficiency of the first one, and this one, it is
a bit longer.
It's longer. It's definitely more
2 hours.
Yeah, and it's much more convoluted. Not quite in a bad way. It's the third. We'll talk about the third, but the third one is when it really tips into convoluted nonsense. But there's some parts of this which threaten to do that, and it gets a bit more soap opera in places too.
It does.
But I still like it. I still like it though. It's good.
Yeah.
You couldn't watch this one first, though, could you?
No.
Exactly.
It would be.
You would miss the point. Yeah. So it would be interesting to see if somebody did to get their take on it. To be fair,
somebody was kind of like, "What order should I watch these in?"
Yeah, we just need to trick somebody.
We just need to find somebody who hasn't watched the Infernal Affairs series and just
who actually cares enough to watch. No, she's seen them. She's seen them all anyway. And,
but I mean, and again, you've got some, as well as Francis saying, you've got some interesting additions to the cast. You've got Roy Chiang, who was always playing sort of gangsters and gangster sides, and he kind of. There was a point where he was in quite a few films, like Wild Search and stuff like that. Kind of always with nice long hair. They're kind of being, and he is both playing two type and against type, which without giving too much of a spoiler on this one. But it was great to see him in a film again because it had been he hadn't seemed to have been a lot of stuff by that point. You got some random stuff like. Teddy Chen, the director Teddy Chen, who turns up in a bit of a bit part in here, and so several other kind of production side, sort of older actors kind of turning up. You've got loads of them. Yeah, you've got Kang Hui in here. Carol
Yes.
Hoycliffe
Yeah, that's right.
as well as Francis Ng's wife. You've got a very unfortunate appearance by a certain British person who we shouldn't even say the name of now, but was well known for his audio commentaries back in the day.
Quite well known for many things.
Yes, and then we're not going to get into other aspects. But I mean, again, it's still packing it with lots of.
It is packed. It's packed is the word. Packed. It's too. It's a bit. That's what I mean. I think it's a little bit too packed. You're right. This is completely long line of cameos and stuff. But that's always the way Hong Kong cinema was before. Like when the first film in any of these Mad series was really popular. Even if it was already an ensemble piece, which kind of the first one is still. But then as soon as you got to the second and third one, you would get more and more people just having tiny cameo roles or turning up in them and everything. So,
and you always have this thing of, I mean, even now you have the sort of the titling on the, it's guest star.
Yeah, that's right.
How it's titled. And you still get it, and you kind of think, oh, okay, they're not. I mean, this is just a film, so why are they guest starring in it? Yeah,
and just for a few seconds, which it's fine. It just makes it all, and I don't like being negative about it because I do like the film a lot, but it is a little bit overstuffed. I could say that. That's probably the nicest way of putting it.
Yeah. But still
strong.
Very watchable. Great performances from.
Oh yeah. I've seen it a few times.
I think particularly. I mean, Sonia is good. I think Edison Chen really channels the way that Andy Lau plays the character. That seems kind of a bit weirdly earnest, almost a bit on the spectrum. Everything's very serious with him. Whereas Tony Leung, who's having a really shit time being having to pretend being a gangster for all this time, is always kind of all quite smiley and looking quite happy. He's and Edison Chen really does channel and do a really good performance as Andy Lau.
And talking of people who maybe we shouldn't mention some of their behaviour, this is a pre-scandal Edison Chen, right? And but it doesn't hurt that he does look a bit like Andy Lau, right? Not you wouldn't confuse them for each other, but he has that kind of similar look in terms of eyes and face shape and things like that. And actually, he's really good in this, and I wouldn't say that about a lot of his performances. I don't think he's one of the top tier, but again, there's a generational thing going here with Sean Yu as well, right? Who they are the. You've got the Tony Leung and Andy Lau are from the previous generation. Yu and Chen are part of a sort of a second generation that are going to. So it's a bit bizarre that it's a prequel that stars the second generation, but you get where I'm coming from. But I thought Chen is excellent in this.
He is,
which I really couldn't say about 90% of his other performances.
I guess we'll never know with him. I guess because after the scandal thing and everything, we're showing like a lot of his early stuff. He was just another sort of pretty boy choice in them and stuff, but he actually became a pretty good actor and stuff. Made a lot of interesting career choices through the 2000s. So with old Chen, obviously he didn't have, his opportunities disappeared very, very quickly as a result. And so I don't know. You're right. I mean, he's very good in this, and it would have suggested that he might have had more, more acting ability in there compared to some of the stuff he'd done early on, where he wasn't really required to do a great deal, but no, he's very good in this one. He's very Poppy Dog in this one, always following what's her name around and with his mouth slightly open.
Infernal Affairs 2, definitely worth watching. And then shall we get on to Infernal Affairs 3? The WTF entry in the trilogy. I guess, it's probably worth mentioning that they did move fast on these sequels, which we know isn't at all uncommon for Hong Kong. But, so the first film came out in December 2002. Infernal Affairs 2 came out in October 2003, and then actually on the anniversary of the first film, Infernal Affairs 3 turned up. Was it 2 hours 20 minutes or however long it is? It's a very long.
It's not actually that long though. It just feels
Isn't
like
it.
No,
are you sure?
There's two versions of it. Remember, one of them is only about an hour and 45, and the other one's about 2 hours or just under 2 hours. So
that might be my fault for. I'm not sure if both versions are on the disc, but
I mean they're not. They're not. No, they're not better. I mean, neither of them's better than the other because they're both. No. So I would, if you haven't seen,
James.
Yeah, I don't think you should care which version you've seen. To be honest, I have seen them both, and the director's cut is just longer. And that's all you can say, and it's a bad thing in this case because it still has all the multiple problems of the slightly shorter version. You know.
So okay, so I mean, it'll say the 2 hours.
你解決唔到我嘅問題，我工作就要出賣身邊嘅人，唔想做黑社會，我想做好人。
你認唔認得我？我認得你，咁小心啲。我係保安科楊錦明，你兩個調查緊我，你知㗎？
跟咗你好耐啦。
我係講埋咁多廢話啦，你幫唔幫我先？
你幫我，我幫你，睇嚟韓心仲未完全順利喎。
唔滿意我？
And I mean, do we want to try? Can we try and sum up what the plot line is for?
Oh, Stephen will do that.
Okay.
You've reviewed it latest.
Yeah, exactly. You've seen it recently, so it must be fresh in your mind.
Obviously, I've written a review up, haven't I, for the site. Okay, so it kind of exists in broadly in 2 timelines, right? So one of the timelines, and they intercut with each other, which really doesn't help because you never know where you are, especially as one character I'll talk about in a minute appears in both timelines and looks exactly the same, and it's not that far apart. So one is a bit like here's a whole set of scenes from the first film which we didn't show you, which is more stories about Tony Leung's character, and just putting a bit more stuff, utterly unnecessary stuff in place to fill in. It doesn't even fill in any holes. What it does, it serves to introduce 2 characters into the second half of the film, which didn't need to play any part. Well, one of the characters is unnecessary. The Chinese undercover. I can't remember the guy's name, the actor, but
Chen Dao-ming.
Yeah.
I have no idea what the point of him was.
No.
Other than to get a mainland actor in it, which...
Yeah.
Well, I think there you go.
Yeah. There's nothing wrong with him. So he's playing yet another undercover cop, but he's a mainland Chinese undercover cop and turns up in the denouement of the second phase. The other thing is to bring Leung Lei's character in as is he or isn't he also a mole, or is he a genuine internal affairs agent? And nothing really happens in this whole section, although it's interlaced throughout the rest of the film, that just says, hey, look, Leung Lei was there as well. And does raise an important point. The only bit that I got out of it is that he recognises Tony Leung's character from the Academy. And you do think... Yeah, why didn't the other 200 people recognise him, or any of his? It may be addressed in the previous film a little bit, in the previous films a little bit, but it does kind of undercut the whole point that Leung's character is trapped once Anthony Wong's killed in the first film. Because there are a lot of other people who would have recognised him as well. And then we have the second storyline follows on from the first film, and Andy Lau's character. Now knows that not only is he a mole, but there's another 4 or 5 moles in the police force as well. He goes down this trying to find all the other moles route. While all the while, his career goes down the drain and his mental health goes down the drain, and it's all horribly generic-y mental health kind of issues. He's seeing hallucinations. He thinks he's turning into Tony Leung's character, and it all is and it has I'm going to do spoilers. It has the world's most pathetic suicide attempt, which thematically I know what they're trying to do. That it's all about this continuous hell, which you talked about at the beginning, Andrew, right?
And they really are giving us continuous hell with...
Yeah, and it's just confusing and unnecessary. And I will also add, if you were mainland Chinese or Singaporean, you wouldn't know what the fuck was going on, because obviously the first film ends differently. Yeah,
because what we didn't bring up, talking about the first film, is the alternative ending that was made for mainland China, because criminals aren't allowed to get away with
Yes, yeah. I have no idea how people would have handled the third one or anything like that after that. So
there isn't any point to it. They really
no.
I mean, they do deliberately do the confusion thing between the timelines as well, which is just a pain in the arse.
It is. It's annoying. Absolutely. It's not even. It doesn't even serve a purpose, though. It's not even. It doesn't really come to some great point about it. It's just.
There's
annoying.
Occasional moments where there's some thematic similarity, I think, but it doesn't work for me. It just confuses, and the film adds the great tragedy of the film is it still looks as good as the other two. It's still got all the stars are in it, which does make you a bit suspect.
Just to add to that before you go on there, it is nice to see Wei Lee, who again was another person from the 80s and 90s who's kind of fallen. You only see him for a few seconds though, but from A Bullet in the Head and some other films, it was nice to see him crop up for a little while.
Yeah, that's true.
Go on, Stephen.
I mean, you've got, it gets you another chance to see Anthony Wong's character, gives you another chance to see Eric Chan's character, it gives you all that, and everyone's having a nice payday, I'm sure, right?
Yeah.
That's what it feels like. It feels like a cash-in, but you're right. It was very... it followed on very quickly from the second sequel in terms of its release in Hong Kong. So I assume they were filmed at the same time or something.
They must have been shooting a lot of this stuff back.
Outtakes. I imagine there's a lot of outtakes and unused footage.
I have
maybe so.
I have no desire to see a re-edited version which inserts that stuff into the first film, though. It's just fundamentally it's unnecessary. And if you get the box set, you get a free coaster, right?
Yeah. Well, we can't condone that for Criterion if they're listening, but I mean it's almost as unnecessary as The Departed. But we'll come on to that in that. Maybe we kind of move on to that now. The kind of the legacy and the influence of Infernal Affairs. I think, we had. I think, what happened next. I think there was a lot of films that tried to emulate this. I mean, let's start with the creative team, which for a while you do have Andrew Lau, Alan Mack, and Felix Chong. Building on the success of Infernal Affairs, they made the obvious choice, and the next film they do is, of course, Initial D.
Yeah, well.
Hong Kong's very own Japanese manga, slightly racist, inspired.
Yes.
Fast and Furious inspired.
Don't they drag Anthony Wong along for that as well?
They do. Yeah. That was one of those films, one of the first times I can remember like really being excited then let down completely by something, because it has the same look as Infernal Affairs. It looks like it's going to be slick and you think it's going to be cool. Then you watch it and it's just stupid. But not even in a fun, stupid way. Nothing. It's one of those films where just nothing about it works. Not in a sort of Infernal Affairs makes me angry kind of way, but it's just dull. Infernal D, Initial D. There's just one of those films where I remember actually I got the DVD from it for it because it came out very quickly after the Hong Kong release. Got it, put it watched it, and okay, well that wasn't great. But it definitely did that same sort of slickness it was going for, though.
It did. And then we got Confession of Pain.
I'd forgotten about that. Great drunk acting. Great drunk acting in that film.
Was trying to go back to that. Perhaps someone that said, "Why are you doing a car driving thing?"
Yeah.
And then they kind of split off again, don't they? I mean, so Mack and Chong become quite a They start the Overheard.
That's the Overheard, yeah.
Series.
That's right. Yes.
And you've got some other films in there like The Lost Bladesman, The Silent War with Tony Leung again. Kind of ends up kind of petering out a bit, and then the Alan Mack and Felix Strong splits up, and Felix Strong is still doing some very similar things, I think, again with Project Gutenberg or whatever,
right?
It is,
yes,
Counterfeit or whatever.
Still not seen that because it's so long.
And I'm sure it's very I know. And I was still annoyed at the UK premiere that I got invited to, but it was free for all with the seats, right. And my wife and I decided not to go to it.
I'd have walked out as well.
And so I'd still never got around to watching it, even though I'm champion fan. I mean,
it does shame us a bit that we haven't seen it.
It does really. It really does. And I guess from kind of directly the kind of career of Andrew Lau, it's kind of interesting. He does try and get. He is still very much trying to get into different markets. You've got Daisy, which is a South Korean film from 2006. A little bit later, quite a bit later on, you've got Revenge of the Green Dragons, which is a US production.
Yeah.
And then there's still time doing other films like The Guillotines and Kung Fu Master, and then
co-director Wong Jing in Vegas to Macau 3. I mean, his must be the highlight of his life.
Yeah, well, I mean, I probably the less said about his kind of more recent efforts with like Chinese doctors and so on, probably the best.
Oh, that's right. And he did The Captain, didn't he? The airline one.
Yeah.
Which I'm glad to say I haven't seen that, or Chinese Doctors. It seems that's where his career is now. Fair play, I guess. But
it's interesting. But from that perspective, it is interesting. He tried and then failed, and then kind of hasn't bothered. Here's Phillip O'Connor.
So, the Infernal Affairs Trilogy. I've known about this movie series since it probably came out over 20 years ago. And I watch it whenever I can. Recently, the Criterion release got me thinking about it. And I just had a couple of thoughts about the series. Mainly, it has to do with the Buddhist concept of hell that permeates the fabric of the series. It's to do with a quote near the end of the movie, I believe it's the first one, where they talk about the idea of continuous hell, the bottommost layer of hell, that to be alive while this happens is hell. And this happens to primarily at the start of the trilogy, when we open the show. We have Chan, played by Tony Leung, who is a police officer who becomes a gangster. And for Chan, it's the idea that he wants to be a good officer, so he follows his commanding officer Wong, who's played by Anthony Wong. He follows his advice and says, if you pretend to drop out, you'll become more amenable to gangsters. Oh, he was a cop at one point, we can use him. And he thinks that he's going to be in this temporary hell for maybe a couple of years, and a decade goes by. And while Infernal Affairs 2 kind of fleshes out the younger version of him as to how he ended up in the place that he is at the beginning of the first movie pretty much sells the entire idea that Chan is the one trapped. Chan spends most of the film trying to get out, either figuratively or literally. And it is the juxtaposition of his plight and then the plight of Lau, played by Andy Lau, who is a criminal who is planted in the police organization by Sam, who's played by Eric Sang. And the film itself spends a lot of the time on Chan's side of the argument, because, for lack of a description, Lau is not the hero, and he isn't going to be the hero in the first movie. Chan is, and the problem with Chan is that he has spent so long as a criminal, he doesn't remember how to be a cop anymore. Now, that's not to say that he goes off and, starts doing criminal activities just for the sheer hell of it, but he no longer remembers what it feels like to be a normal person, to not have to constantly look over your shoulder, to worry about who has your back, who doesn't have your back, who's ratting you out, who is trying to, step on your neck to get further up the totem pole. And it sells the idea of this idea of continuous hell, this perpetual vice that Chan finds himself in. And as the film goes on, we see the pressure heaping upon him. We see him being interviewed by Lee, played by Kelly Chen, a psychologist, who tries to help him, to try and pull him back from the edge, so to speak. The problem with it is that this collision course that he's on with Lau means that no matter how much pressure is taken off him, the minute he leaves the psychologist's office, it's there waiting for him, hovering like a dark cloud. And ultimately, the film resolves Chan's problem by simply eliminating Chan. He's spectacularly killed at the end of the film, much to the shock of anyone who watched the film initially on discovering the trilogy, either back in the day or recently, Criterion's release. You're shocked by it, because we've been conditioned and poked and prodded by cinema to expect that the hero doesn't die at the end of the movie. The hero's reward is to, be found out and, you cracked the case and everything's fine. But remember, that's a Western concept primarily. It does happen in other cultures, but it's primarily a Western concept. Or specifically, it's a Hollywood concept where the hero will always come out right in the end. And even if he doesn't, he goes down in a blaze of glory that saves the universe and all is right. And at the end of Infernal Affairs 1, not only are things not right, but that things are worse than ever before, because now Sam has his hooks directly into Lau. And I will get to Lau in a second. At the end of the movie, Chan is killed, and while Sam doesn't survive the end of the movie because he's killed by Lau and Lau's attempt to clean up all of the loose threads that link him back to his criminality, the damage is done. Sam has infected Lau now with the same problem that afflicted Chan at the start of the movie. This crushing weight that he cannot escape from, that he can never get away from. Turning to Lau is the other end of that scale. If Chan's release from this continuous hell is to be killed, and thereby is taken away from the pressure of the problem, Lau is the idea of a man makes his own personal hell by himself. He doesn't have to have hell foisted upon him like it was with Chan. He can make it for himself. And Lau does this to himself because near the end of the first film, right, Chan and Lau have this equalization moment where Sam is killed, Lau is off the hook, and Chan has his identity protected. He doesn't have to worry about it. And there's this equalizing moment where both of them, for the briefest of moments, can switch. Lau can go on to become a good cop and can leave his criminal past behind, and Chan can retire from the police force having done his job. But then, the way the film plays out, that's not what happens, and ultimately Chan is killed as a direct result of the events of the final act of the film. But it is in that act that Lau becomes the man-made hell. And he becomes the man-made hell because, quite literally, the fact that Chan is killed has doomed Lau into this perpetual hell where he will always look over his shoulder. He will never have a moment's peace. He will never be able to escape from the past that he had. He will always worry that someone will blow his cover. And the problem for it is that it is ultimately self-defeating. Eventually, the sins that he has heaped upon himself to get where he is come back to haunt him, and ultimately Lau is left a broken man as a result of the events of the third film. I find that the series also does an excellent job of promoting the idea that while the main two characters are in their own personal hells, Chan at the start of the trilogy, Lau at the end of the trilogy, the other characters as I said, Lee, the psychologist, Sam, Lau's criminal boss, Wong, Chan's superintendent, and his father figure. And the thing about father figures is that, you know, the sins of the father are visited upon the son. And in the case of Wong starts off by asking Chan to go undercover, and it's done with the best of intentions, but the longer that Wong keeps Chan in there, the worse it becomes. And like a father who realizes that his son is on a self-destructive path, Wong wants to help him, but at the same time, if he pulls him out too soon or too early, all their work will be for nothing. But ultimately, in both cases, both Wong and Sam pay the price for their sins. In the case of Sam has multiple moles, but it is Lau, the smartest, slickest, brightest of his lieutenants. It's the one that comes back to haunt him the most, and it's the one that kills him in the end. And I find the series as a whole, no one gets out of life alive. And in the case of the cast of Infernal Affairs, no one does. Lau's wife is left bereft because she doesn't know anything about Lau's alter ego as a criminal. She knows nothing about him. She only knew him as a cop. And she's left bereft because of all of the bodies that have been stacked up at Lau's doorstep. Lau is now paying the price for. And on the other side of it, you know, Chan had a life and a partner before all this, and that was all just blown to hell. On top of that, like, every single person, both in the criminal organization and the cops, who were destroyed as a result of the mayhem caused by both Chan and Lau's exit stage left. Nobody comes out of this unscathed, and I think that's the thing that I take away the most from Infernal Affairs. Not the subterfuge, not the amazingly simplistic and yet brilliant concept of what if a cop and a criminal swapped places and no one knew. More than any of that, more than the direction by the directors Andrew Lau and Alan Mack, it's the idea that people just get crushed by the situation they find themselves in. And while for us at the audience it's absolute manna from heaven to watch these actors go through the motions and watch their hellish torment, in reality we would never be able to survive such a concept. We'd never be able to make it out of there in one piece. And ultimately the movie is realistic. Ultimately the movies are realistic in that even the people who get away with their lives are ultimately destroyed by it. And this cycle of death and rebirth, of punishment and reward, it's just soaked into the fabric of the trilogy, and no one is able to get out of the trilogy untainted by the actions of two men in two closed off dark rooms in two separate buildings making separate plans. It's just amazing to see this in action, and I think that's the thing I take away the most from Infernal Affairs. The smallest of actions, this tiniest of decisions have massive repercussions, and it's never been done so well in Hong Kong cinema, I think, and in general in cinema in its totality of this tiny decision. I mean, when we talk about crime thrillers like say the Godfather trilogy, we look at them as a whole, as a conglomeration of the entire threads of the story. But Infernal Affairs would not have happened were it not for Sam and Wong making that decision to send one of their own people into the other guy's organization. And it's that like, you get three separate films, and yes, we can argue about the merits of the first and second and third movies and whether or not the second movie is better than the third, or whether the third movie is really necessary at all. We could have just skipped part two. It doesn't matter about that. That's a story for another day. It's a discussion for another day, which I believe the gentlemen you are listening to on the other end of this piece that I'm doing are talking about right now. And I think that's the impressive thing I love the most about Infernal Affairs. It's the thing that keeps me coming back to the series year on year. I always try and show it to people, even people who've seen The Departed, the Martin Scorsese remake with Matt Damon and Jack Nicholson and Leonardo DiCaprio. I always tell them to go and watch Infernal Affairs because it does a much better job of showing you what true sin and what the wages of that is in relative terms to a character's fate. So with that, I would just simply say to you that Infernal Affairs is one of those trilogies that pays out the more you watch it. You sit there and you think about the what ifs, and if the character had done this or said that or gone here, and it's one of those wonderful things that no matter which decision you think the character should have made, ultimately you realise that the characters end up exactly where they're supposed to. They know that they're on this road to damnation, and yet they're quite not so much resigned, but knowledgeable in that they knew going in that this is a possibility and this could happen, and now it has happened for them, and we are bearing witness to this destruction of the soul and this adulation of the sin.
The big legacy was, of course, The Departed, with the most pointless Oscar ever given, perhaps.
Yes. Yeah, this is only one, isn't it? Or
but not exactly.
Was his first one or his only one? Either way.
Yeah.
Jeez, man, I'm not a Scorsese fan anyway, but to give him the other stuff I can appreciate, even if I don't like it, but that's giving him it for that is just odd. You know.
I mean, I did watch it once just to see what it was like. But if I want to watch it again, then I will watch Infernal Affairs again. I'm not.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem with it, isn't it? Is that it's very well made. Again, it's more stargazing, right? You get Leonardo DiCaprio. Well, you get Marky Mark as well, I suppose. You know, although he has done a couple of good things, this isn't one of them.
No Funky Bunch, though. If there's no Funky Bunch, then what's the point?
Yeah, you know, it's no Boogie Nights, right?
It's not The Happening. That's his best. He has a conversation with the plastic plant.
Indeed, you get a Jack Nicholson cameo that overwhelms everything else. Yeah, as always.
Which happens.
He just tries to devour everyone in the film. Yeah. Every time he's in there, he just looks like he's going to bite people.
And it's that era of Jack Nicholson, isn't it? Where that's what he does. It's fine. It's moved to Boston, I think, and so so the Buddhist themes are turned in Buddhist themes are turned into Catholic ones.
That's right.
It's fine. I mean, if you don't like Scorsese, it's not going to turn you into a fan. I don't even know it was up against the Oscar that year, but I bet it wasn't really that. I bet we could both pick two other films in the list that would be there. But it's not horrible. I mean, in the big scheme of things, remakes of Asian movies, there's some absolute car crashes. This is a well made but redundant. It doesn't do anything new. It doesn't do anything extra. It just lifts it. You know.
And some of it just so kind of almost exactly scene for scene. Some of the best scenes in there are to within a whisper of being an absolute duplication.
Yeah. And isn't it like an hour longer than the original film as well? So
in my head, it's 2.5 hours, which probably
that's what it is in my head as well.
Probably means it's 2 hours, because once you go over 2 hours, then you're
no film needs to be longer.
Unless it's 3 hours. Unless it's 3 hours.
Yeah.
If it makes the full jump to 3, I'm okay with it. But 2 hours 20, when I see 2 hours 20, I'm already marked it down a star just out of grumpiness.
Let's have a look.
I mean, it's too much of it is too on the nose.
151 minutes. So
you're
2.5.
right. So 2.5. Jesus Christ. I mean, there's no chance I'd watch it again anyway. But the other thing about it, so many parts. There's so much filler in there, and then there's so many parts of it. Whereas you said the original Infernal Affairs, we've all used the word efficient so many times, and this is not efficient at all. There's so much stuff in this which is just nothing. It's just Scorsese being a bit Scorsese and working in like another, sort of gritty-ish street dialogue scene. So there's no. I just don't see any need for it to. Well, I don't see massive need for it to exist, but I don't see any need for him to do it the way he did it, because he, as you say, like some parts of it they're just lifted from it. They're just almost shot for shot, and then he just goes off on pointless tangents which don't change or add anything to it. They just add scenes of the actors. It's an actor's film type of thing, where it's almost like old Scorsese. I mean, he's getting on a bit. He might be in his sleep or something. Just let Marky Mark and old Leo just have at each other and hide from Jack Nicholson and saying, don't worry.
Yeah, it's got Matt Damon as well. Basically, it's got everybody in it.
Yeah,
And Ray Winston.
everyone.
Ray Winston turns up in it as well.
That's right. Got that.
Does he have what accent? Wow. Is he doing an American accent in it?
I think he's doing an Irish, like Boston accent.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay,
It's been a long time since I've seen it, but I was just checking the Wikipedia page, and all these memories are coming back, and I'm thinking, I'm still not.
God, I'd completely forgotten about good old Ray.
No, I had no idea he was.
It's hardly nil by mouth, is it?
No,
it's hardly scum.
No, Christ.
But,
it could be.
It's just. Like I say, I think I'm going to give it a little bit of a pass because of those horrendous remakes we've got, especially of some of the sort of those, that period where Infernal Affairs came out. We've got all that J horror stuff coming over. We've got, it is this gateway thing coming through for Asian cinema, and it's quite nice that one of them wasn't a horror movie. Because or a romantic trip. It's not The Lake House. There's another one.
The Lake House, yes, with Keanu and Sandra Bullock.
Misses the point completely. So, but
I haven't seen it. I'm happy to say.
But it's just it's harmless. But it's 2.5 hours you don't need to spend when you can go and spend an hour and a half with the original. I get not everybody's into. Subtitles. Yeah. However, you're listening to this podcast. You must be all right with subtitles, unless you're one of those.
Do you think most Scorsese fans, I'm sure there's a large part of his box office which isn't taken up with like cinephiles or whatever. I do not like the word, but it sounds like it sounds too much like pedophile. But like, you think most proper like Scorsese cinephile fans would be okay with subtitles. So it's an odd choice for him. To have and I do remember reading something about not contractual obligations, but something along those lines. Because I think, is it produced by who produced it in the end? Was Roy Lee involved in it in some way?
Brad Pitt bought the rights, actually.
Oh, it's just his company. But
Brad Pitt, Brad Gray, Brad Pitt. Everyone called Brad.
That's a lot of Brads in the film. I don't know, but either way, it just doesn't feel. I don't know. It's a strange choice. Like I said, I'm not a big fan of Scorsese at all, but it seems like a slightly odd choice for him to have done in that respect. To take on a fairly recent film, remake it in a much more sort of traditional Hollywood commercial way, packed with big name stars, and both stick to a simple story than completely overstuff it. It seems like a slightly strange move for me, but I don't know. I don't know. Maybe you'll get some angry Scorsese fans coming in now.
Let's hope so.
Well, as long as they listen.
Listenership or whatever.
That's the most. James hates Scorsese. Exactly. That's just what you should just label the podcast.
That's how we're going to advertise this podcast. So we got The Departed, and I think I wasn't going to kind of go into it before. Was it? I think you do. This does colour a lot of the films that come out of Hong Kong after it, which I guess was always going to happen. You've got these, you do end up with films like Divergent Cop, and I think it gets built into a lot of the Johnny Toes that come after it as well. That some of those films have much more of this kind of feel. They're quite, again, they become quite talky and a bit of happenstance going on and stuff like that. These kind of ideas, all the way through to things like Cold War. And I think even kind of across Asia, you can even kind of include things like On the Job, which is it is a different film, but this idea that you've got these prisoners who get let out to do an assassination, and it does start to kind of it does get into all these films, but. At the end of the day, I mean, what do we think about is the legacy of Infernal Affairs? I mean, for me, I think I come back to it's kind of an interesting point, and actually, even as we're kind of talking about it now, that you've got this thing of the first one, definitely the first film being very Western focused, and then actually the middle one, plot line, is actually coming up to The Handover, which is quite interesting. That's in the background. And the last one, you're having a mainland Chinese character, even though they wouldn't have been able to sell the film particularly well to mainland China. it feels like that for that first one there was something that, and it wasn't just Infernal Affairs. It was films like what Peter Chan was producing at the time, with the particularly with the sort of horror side of things. That there was a moment where stuff was starting to cross over, and then, I mean, just pragmatically, lots of particularly Hong Kong directors refocused to mainland China because the scene was there. It's like there was a different path there that could have been taken.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to look at Infernal Affairs, as just representing Hong Kong so much at that time. And the post handover anxiety was very, very strong, and that's where the mirroring and everything isn't always massively subtle, and these kind of blurring the lines and everything between different identities, and the whole idea of Hong Kong itself being in continuous hell, going through the finance crisis, SARS, handover, and everything, and how we look at that, for Hong Kong today and everything, whether that's still something relevant that's continuing. But I think that's something Hong Kong cinema, it was doing so much through the 90s as well. It was kind of reflecting a lot of these anxieties and themes, like not knowing what's going to happen with the mainland and everything. And even when we get to the third film and stuff, with the mainland character in there, not really knowing what they're doing, what's going on, it's still, I don't know, there's something about the themes of the film, whether you choose to read into them or not, which still seem actually quite fresh and relevant today, which I quite like and stuff. I don't think it revolutionized the Hong Kong film industry quite as much as some people have reported it as having done and stuff, because you're totally right, it inspired not even so much the films it inspired, but the look it inspired, or it was the first one to really typify that cleaner look.
I think it was also, and it's not a massive twist in Infernal Affairs, but there was that, and it also, there was a bit of that sort of M. Night Shyamalan, that every film had to have some sort of twist at the end.
Yeah, there was a bit of that.
And that was all, to be fair, that was already kind of coming through from the influence of Sixth Sense on things like Inner Senses. You had the last reveal, but you've got a bit of that, which actually, in kind of hindsight now, feels actually not actually particularly shocking in Infernal Affairs as much as some of the other things that go on. Perhaps because I've seen it, I remember it. And of course, I mean, we completely forgot to mention that slight spoiler alert, but that we have good old Gordon Lamb in there as well, whose career over the last couple of years has massively taken off. But kind of appears in the sidelines and then appears a bit more in some more of the Johnny To films that come later. But there was this idea, and you get it with Divergent Comics and our ones, that definitely in the overheard films and so on, that there's this there has to, every film, not necessarily even in the same genre as well, it could be horror, it could be kind of crime procedural, police procedural type things. There has to be a twist at the end, which actually at a certain point just became really exhausting, particularly when it wasn't done particularly well. And it was that, and again, that wasn't necessarily just Hong Kong films. I think it was in other regions as well, but particularly in Hong Kong films, that's one thing that became quite a part of the film language. Oh, but no, you didn't realise.
No, I think that's fair.
I mean, there's something, I was sort of going back to something you said right at the beginning, James, about Hong Kong cinema basically was dead at this point. This does feel a bit like the last gasp. This is the last. I can't think of another Hong Kong film that's really made it internationally.
When we were talking about Time and Tide, we were actually kind of foretelling this as, which was 1999 or 2000 when it was. And we had a good chat about that. This was leading up to that kind of. It was that last few years of really kind of great Hong Kong cinema, and I think we all wanted more. And that's not what we got. I mean, I'm not saying there haven't been good Hong Kong films, but it's that kind of international appeal, and now it's the same way like Korean cinema and TV has like taken over the world. And this is a very similar time period to that first Hallyu wave. That's just run, and Hong Kong cinema for all sorts of reasons. I get it, political and blah blah blah, that I don't really want to get into. But can you think of many other films that Criterion are going to pick up from Hong Kong post 2002?
Which ones? How many could they actually get the rights to? It's probably an interesting question on that score as well. But no, absolutely, it's one of the. If nothing else, there's not that many which have felt as accomplished in the genre. We still had some great Hong Kong indie films and some pretty decent comedies and stuff. I mean, less and less recently, but yeah, this was one of those last ones, and this one of it is an interesting legacy from Infernal Affairs. Is it's so much of it. There's nothing art house at all about it, but there is something, and the fact that Criterion have put it in there and everything, that is kind of elevating it a bit. And I think some of Johnny To's films get elevated beyond not their quality, but beyond their possibly what their sort of cinematic ambitions, if that's the way to put it, were. Which is, that's something you just get. It's fair enough. We're always going to have in the West a certain different way of looking at films, Asian films, which in Asia are perhaps a more
I think there's definitely a snobby. There's a air of snobbiness to that. I'm not going to get into a massive rant about film criticism and all that, but we from Europe and the US, we're always kind of told to look up to kind of French New Wave as the and in Asian cinema, I think you get a similar thing happening with Japanese film, just because people were more aware of it, I think, earlier. And the industries existed to a greater extent. But, this is going back to stuff that we were applauding in the 50s and 60s. And it's starting to move away from that. And also, and on top of that, you've got this, it's kind of weird and contradictory when you think of, if you really want to hold up those French New Wave films, where actually lots of stuff was genre. And it kind of really kind of playing around with genre. And yet we everything has to be tied to very serious dramas, that somehow the genre films aren't deserving. And it's like, you can't have it both ways, No, there's nothing wrong with a really well-made genre film.
No, I couldn't agree more.
I don't know, but I don't want to get into already stepping into my little rant about that. But, that is part of it. That is part of.
Well, it's part of Infernal Affairs specifically. The way we were saying it's looked at now, because this is not what you'd call auteur cinema. I mean, Lau and Mack are, they've done great films in their time. They've done terrible films. I mean, Alan Mack did Nude Fear, which is still probably his best film, his first one, good bit of Category 3, but they're not. So this, I do find it interesting that Infernal Affairs is partly embraced on that side of things, and it being included, by given this treatment by Criterion and stuff. It's not so much being remastered as this sort of. Just as a great, incredibly popular Hong Kong film, which was then remade, which went on. There is almost it's being admitted to that kind of club, or however you'd call it, without being too cynical about it, where it suddenly becomes more worthy. But it is a pretty straightforward genre film when you come down to it, which didn't have those kind of ambitions when it was being made. It definitely was appealing to Western and international audiences as well, but. I don't know. I mean, you're right. It's not a place to go into a massive discussion on this, but it is a very interesting subject, and I'm guessing a lot of the people, who might actually buy this Criterion one won't be. they'll be. Hopefully, they'll watch the third one because they deserve it. That's probably the funniest part of it, is thinking some highfalutin cinephiles out buying it and stuff to see this great new wave, whatever they call the wave of Hong Kong cinema. Who knows, man? But then, you're good news. Watch the third one. That'll learn you.
It definitely will. The Infernal Affairs Trilogy is available now on Blu-ray from Criterion in the USA and the UK. So thanks to Stephen for joining us for this episode.
Pleasure as always.
Always great to have you on the show.
It is.
Don't forget, you can find all of our previous episodes on Apple, Amazon Music, Spotify, Google, or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe now and you'll never miss an episode. But for now, cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.